Awesome. Welcome all, and welcome Bret. I'm going to do a quick intro. It's actually kind of hard to introduce Bret because he's done so much in his career, but I'll try.
Just hit the high points.
OK, I'll try.
Liberally edit.
Well, he's one of the inventors of Google Maps, which I think a lot of people don't even know. After he's at Google, he was the co-founder of FriendFeed, and he went on to become the CTO of Facebook.
I have a funny story about FriendFeed later.
OK, I'm down for that.
Yeah.
And after Facebook, he founded a company called Quip, which I'm sure many of us have used, and then went to Salesforce, where he was co-CEO. One thing we're not going to talk about today is the little bit of drama that Bret was in 2022 with Elon over Twitter. He was on the board of Twitter. Twitter sold. Some people weren't sure if it sold. That was 2022. Now it's 2023. We're not going to talk about that. And now he's starting a new company, an enterprise AI company that we're also not allowed to talk about today, apparently.
Well, I think the theme here is creating, and it's a little bit easier in the early stages to create in private. So maybe next year we can talk more about it.
OK, I'm going to take you up on that.
That sounds great.
So I want to start off with a question that I ask all the new Figmates when they join. And this is kind of inspired because when we were talking a week ago, you casually dropped that you wanted to be a cinematographer in high school. And now you're in this legendary software career. And so I'm curious, outside of work, what makes you a maker?
So actually, it's interesting you start with cinematography. Most of my outside tinkering and making is with software. That's how much I absolutely love building. I always have one or two side projects going, actually. So when we first got an Alexa in our house, my kids were really young. So I made it because they could go up to the Alexa and ask it to print a coloring page. And I had this Rube Goldberg machine of code to connect it to the printer, which turns out all printers run Linux. Who knew? And I figured out how to get it to print. And when I was the CEO of Salesforce, released an air quality tracking app, and we had all these fires, and I got a bunch of emails at it, because unfortunately on the East Coast and in Canada, it became very useful this year as well. I hate for that to be my tinkering legacy, is something so horrible as tracking fires. But I'm a huge believer in it. I actually think that product design is a lot about the quality of the designer's intuition. And I think that designers are sort of who are in an ivory tower, either don't experiment with new tools, or don't spend enough time with customers, or don't expose themselves to new ideas, can often sort of either produce bad designs or more often just like a local maximum. So I always just try to be tinkering, mainly just so that I'm learning the nuances of things I wouldn't be exposed to in my day-to-day job.
That's awesome. And I'm curious, you're somebody that I would say really straddles not only development, but also design and product and leadership in general. Looking back, how have you continually built that intuition across so many fields and evolved yourself? Because I think that's probably something that a lot of people here are interested in.
It's a great question. I haven't always done it well. I've had a number of different jobs. So when I was at university, I was a computer science graduate. I went to, got a master's degree at Stanford as well. And I was a systems programmer, so down in the bowels of software. I had a teaching assistant named Marissa Meyer who had gone to Google, who convinced me to become a product manager there.
I've heard of her, yeah.
Yeah, she's a mentor of mine, friend, came to my wedding, also hired my wife at Google. It was really interesting though, because I remember I got to the end of the Google interview process and I still wasn't sure what a product manager actually was. Because you ask people what it is, and you get like a different answer from everybody. It's like, you ask most engineers, like, I don't know what the hell they do. Jeez, it's like, write documents, and then you ask product managers, and they make themselves sound like the CEO of everything. And I'm like, I literally have no idea what I'm getting into. But I followed Marissa because I really liked her, and it turned out to be a really wonderful move. I think probably the most impactful moment, though, on stretching myself as an individual, when I became CTO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg was a mentor of mine. She's a mentor to, I think, the whole leadership team there. And I had just become CTO, and there's a big organizational change. I had taken a lot more responsibility, and I think I just wasn't working on the right things. And I think though it was subconscious, I think my model was I was trying to say, like, trying to make the job conform to my personality and my leadership style. And I can't remember the words that Sheryl told me, but she had this way of telling you something the way like a family member can, like extremely harsh, but they love you, And she said something like that to me, and it kind of woke me up. And the next day I woke up and said, rather than trying to make the job conform to me, I said, what is the most useful thing I can do today in this job to like produce the outcome I'm looking for? And I ended up way out of my comfort zone, working on things that I wasn't very comfortable with. And I think that door opened for me where I think I'm much more of a chameleon now, where I wake up and whatever job I have, I don't try to make it conform to my skill set. I almost try to take a step outside of my body and say, like, if I were giving myself advice what to do, what would I do? And I do that. And it's been a real breakthrough for me, and that's why I think I've been able to wear so many hats in my career.
Yeah, and I definitely can relate to that. I mean, I think scaling Figma, and we're not as big as Salesforce is, obviously, but...
You will be.
Oh, boy.
It's going to be great.
Okay. We'll talk about that later. But I definitely can relate to that in terms of having to adapt the job and address new challenges and figure out what you can do to make things better. But I'm curious, looking back, in those moments where, for example, at Facebook, you were saying, okay, there's new challenges. Not sure if I'm comfortable doing these, but I'm going to do them anyway. I'm sure sometimes you hit a home run. Other times it didn't work out as you planned. Like, what were some of the failures along the way and the low points that you look back on and go, man, that didn't go so great, but it was a valuable learning opportunity?
I have two stories. I'll just do one, and you can let me know whether you want to do the second one too. So when I was at Google, when I got to Google, I was probably the third or fourth product manager there. I don't remember, but it was a really small company at the time. And I was working on search and had earned my stripes. Like, I developed credibility with the really amazingly overqualified engineering team there. And when you're like a 22-year-old, you have to earn your credibility before people listen to you. And so Marissa gave me a challenge of working on local search. At the time, you could find any web page on Google, but you couldn't find like a local plumber or a local restaurant. And the first version of the product that I worked on, with the team was really bad. I mean, not horribly bad, but definitely not good enough to take market share from the market leader at the time, which was Yahoo Yellow Pages. And in part, it was a bit of a Me Too product. Like, it basically took the Yellow Pages and digitized it, as opposed to really imagining a new experience. It's a longer story, but it ended up where it ended up transitioning to Google Maps. We ended up in the process
I'm actually curious to hear the longer story. Like, how did that happen, going from Yellow Pages to Google Maps?
Okay, well, it's your fault that this is going long. So Google was interesting because you could launch a really bad product, and it turns out if you have a really bad product, but you put a link to that product from the Google homepage, you get a shit ton of traffic. So it's very hard to sort of distinguish between like mediocre products and great products because the baseline is so high. So we launched this product, and it was getting a reasonable amount of traffic, but I think everyone sort of knew, like, just in terms of taste, it wasn't really like a new experience. So in the process of sort of diagnosing like what was bad about the product, we were embedding maps from a third-party technology provider, and they were just, what's the design term, fugly? They were really bad. Little 256 pixel by 256 pixel granulated. It's interesting too, just it was really, it's olden days of the internet. It was like expensive to generate images dynamically, so they're just really unattractive maps. We ended up trying to search for teams working on mapping, and ended up finding two Danish engineers named Lars and Jens Rasmussen. working in a completely different domain. In fact, they had a product called Expedition, which was a Windows app that was a piece of mapping software. But they had beautiful maps. Because they were European, they used the A to Z mapping style, which is just a really, if you know in the UK, it's just a much more attractive map. And because it was Windows software, they weren't burdened by the web browsers, which were very limited in the day, so it was just really beautiful and dynamic. We brought that team into Google, and two things happened. One is we ended up thinking of mapping as kind of the anchor tenant of the user experience. Really thinking is like rather than a search box and listings being the way you browse local things, using the two-dimensional surface of a map. Not rocket science, but when you start designing that way, you really change your product design. The second thing, though, which was an accident, but a really important one, was Lars and Jens had written this Windows app. So all of a sudden, the product experience standard was this amazingly interactive, amazingly high quality application that could only be implemented in C++. And our goal was to get it to work in a web browser. And the reason why Google Maps sort of took the world by storm was because when we launched, you could drag the map, and it was so interactive, and it was sort of, I think, one of the first couple truly interactive web applications. And the only reason that happened is because we set our standards to that impossibly high standard of this Windows application. I still wonder, had we not found Lars and Jens, would we have even had that standard? It was so impossibly high. So I've tried to take lessons from that. I think it might just also be a happy accident. But I do think when you're doing a product design, sometimes you can subconsciously iterate within the confines of the technology that you're given. And if you break outside of that for a bit and give yourself a North Star that is technically extremely hard or perhaps impossible, you start to ask why a lot and end up, I think, coming up with some interactions and things that are a lot more interesting. So I've tried to artificially reproduce that, not quite so successfully since, but it was a really amazing experience in design.
I love that because it reminds me of how my co-founder, Evan, really stretched the bounds of what was possible in the browser as well with Figma. And Evan always thought about things as sort of proof by example. Oh yeah, a lot of people tell me this is not possible, but I'll just go build something that is this way, and then no one can argue with me.
I remember when I first met Evan and he described how you were implementing Figma, I was like, he's either right or crazy. You're right, though,
Yep.
So good for him. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, ESBuild is another project where he was able to take the JavaScript build time for a bunch of projects and minify that as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a special skill to be able to inspire teams that way. I'm curious on the technical side, what other times in your career have you seen that in action, where some impossible standard has been set and then you meet it?
Well, actually, I think we're in the midst of something right now with artificial intelligence that I think is really exciting, technologically, but also from a product design standpoint. And I haven't completely wrapped my head around it. Despite starting a company in this space, I think we're collectively, as technologists and as society, kind of wrapping our head around the implications of large language models in particular. And when I think of large language models, I really think it unlocks three things. Number one is natural language understanding. And I think that's extremely powerful. I think since the beginning of the first time I've used a computer, there's been remedial natural language interfaces, all of which sucked. And I think we're at the point now with large language models that truly computers can understand us speaking and our writing to such a degree that it's actually an effective interface. That's really interesting. Number two is it can generate text and images and videos, and I assume that's been a big topic here at Config, and that's why generative AI has been sort of the headline in a lot of newspapers. And number three is basic human level reasoning. I think since I was at Stanford, most computer science is a bunch of if statements, and you essentially hard code the rules of the system. And I think we're at a point now with agents built on top of large language models that you can give computers goals and guardrails and affect an outcome, which is really interesting. And I think when I look at major technological shifts like going from the mainframe to the PC or the PC to the browser connected to the internet and the birth of the smartphone, building user experiences native to that platform was very different than just adding new capabilities on top. And I think it's really compelling. And I think probably the one I'm most excited about, even though it's the most literal and simple, is actually natural language interfaces and conversational interfaces. I don't know how many of you had this experience, but older people in your family, for me, like my grandparents, their first computer was an iPad. And it was really interesting because they lived through the PC era, but it was always intimidating to use. And all of a sudden you put not just Apple's product design, but just the ergonomics of a touch interface are so much more intuitive to someone who's not an expert in computers than a mouse and a keyboard. Well, look how natural language is, And so I do hope that once we all reimagine a lot of interfaces with conversational interfaces sort of at the forefront, just think of how many more people can benefit from the products that all of us develop. I think it can improve accessibility. I think it can improve access to computers in really dramatic ways that is really exciting. And then the thing just as a geek that I'm excited about is, using, AI for reasoning. And just, I think the idea that computers can do things you didn't plan for them to do is both scary and extremely exciting. And it's what pulled me back in. I left Salesforce, and I think it took me like 4 days to start a new company. My wife made fun of me for that, but I was like, this is possibly the coolest technical moment of my career. Like, I have to do this. Like, I'm just going to be obsessing about it either way, so might as well do it. It's super exciting. I can't think of a time I've been more excited about the future of technology.
I couldn't agree more, and we've been talking a lot about AI, of course, at Figma right now. One of the things we talked about in the keynote this morning was how our belief is that AI will get you to a good first draft, but I still believe that it'll take humans and their teams to go from that first draft to a world-class product. And I'm curious if you agree with that and how you see AI impacting the world of design and more broadly. And also all the roles of everybody here.
I strongly agree that AI is an amplifier for design and all creative products. Here's the way I think about it. I think right now, when you think about what it means to design, you often think of the tools you use, like how you actually affect that screen or that interaction or that animation, whatever it may be that you're designing. But what design is the output of that. Like what are the products that you help your colleagues produce? And I think just like it's almost too contrite of an example, but you don't ask your accountant, like, did you type that number into the spreadsheet? Come on, be real. Did someone else type that number? Because you don't care. What you care about is like how much you're paying on your tax return, or what your cash flow looks like this quarter. And I think the idea that for design to be like produced by you, you needed to click that button, or you needed to actually draw that shape. I think that's a little silly. I mean, that's maybe artisanal design, like handcrafted down to the pixel. What really matters, though, is like the design of the products that we're producing. And I think actually I think there's two really exciting things about where AI will take design from my perspective. And as you said, I'm not like a designer. I design, but it's not the only thing I do. Number one is
Figma a surprising amount.
I absolutely.
Like, I think you're a DAU.
I am addicted to Figma, and I love it. I love everything about it. I'm happy to be any commercials, anything you want me to do. I truly am.
I'll put that as a second follow-up point from this conversation.
I've been using Figma, I think, more or less since the beginning. Anyway, I'd love to know my user number. So number one is I think it will reduce gatekeeping. So I think for a long time, like it was always a joke in the age of Photoshop, just how like opaque that product was and the terminology, and it was like this rite of passage, where you had to like overcome it to use it. Products like Figma and others have made that easier by using metaphors and user interfaces that are easier. But if you think about you're a product leader or a front-end engineer who has good taste or a good idea, the fact that you really need to sort of get a PhD in different types of tools to actually produce something for your team to look at, I don't think it's good for design. And I'm hopeful that AI will just improve access by making the hard stuff a little bit easier and the easy stuff instantaneous. And I think that we can really get there with AI tools. The other thing that I think is really powerful for, I assume many people in the role design professionally or manage people who design professionally, I think we're just going to go from being not just producers of content, but sort of editors and orchestrators of content. And I think it's going to give great designers a ton of leverage. I just think of, I did want to be a cinematographer at one point in high school, and think about the act of storyboarding. It's a craft, and I was bad at it, but it was important, and now if you just think of the act of using like tools like Midjourney or Dolly or Adobe's amazing new tools I tried out the other day, just really sick. You can actually do things like imagine a scene, describing it, and just imagine how much that drives leverage in the creative process of actually coming up with how you want to film a movie. And I think designers in the future will, rather than look at some of these tools as competitive, they're sort of competitive with some of the things you do to produce design, but I don't think they're competitive with design. Design is about taste. Design is about insight. And the other thing I'll just say, and I hope many of you have had this experience, I think things like ChatGPT are probably the first time I've used technology as like a creative foil, where you can ask it to critique your ideas, you can ask it for new ideas. That's pretty mind-blowing. So I am extremely bullish on AI and design. I think the idea that it's competing for our jobs, I think, reduces our jobs to something much smaller than they are.
I agree. And one of the things I've done a lot with ChatGPT or Bard, to your point, is I'll ask it for the 5 obvious answers to the problem I'm trying to solve. And then I'm like, okay, are any of those 5 obvious answers the answer? If not, let me keep thinking about it. And that way I don't end up with a cliche when I'm trying to write or trying to explore space. And I think Figma can do some similar things there as well. I'm curious, there's a mix of individual designers as well as people that are leading and managing design teams in the room. And for this new age that you're describing, what would be your tips for people leading those teams about how they should reorient the way that they work or their teams work in anticipation of what's to come?
I've never been in a wave of new technology where the future is so unknown. I don't know if you share this feeling, but we're friends with a lot of leaders in the technology industry. And every conversation you start talking about your hypotheses, what will come next, what industries will be disrupted. And then sort of by the end of it, you're like, we have no idea what the hell is going to happen. We have no idea. The technology, I think, represented by these foundation models, Palm, GPT-4, Claude, and others, they're very powerful, they're somewhat opaque, and I think we're still wrapping our collective heads around how they work. I think it'll be very hard, particularly for enterprise leaders in the room, to say, this is going to happen, then that, then that, then that, and pull that thread and have any level of accuracy. What I can say with a great deal of personal conviction is I do think it will impact the way we work. I think every person will have a co-pilot for their job. Every tool will incorporate generative AI so that the sort of multi-dimensional autocomplete that generative AI represents that will make us all more productive. And I think there'll be some areas of business where people can really analytically say, the capabilities of AI today should impact this business. I'm going to invest in it and sort of deal with the uncertainty of the technology in its current form. But I think the most productive thing is to have an open mind. If you run a development team, let them use a code generation tool. If you have a design team, turn on the generative AI features and see how it impacts your job. Find a way to open up access to things like ChatGPT that works for your compliance team. Mainly because I think we are all figuring out the second and third order effects of these technologies, but the one way to figure out how it will impact your business is to actually use it. And I think sort of a central planning committee of innovation is rarely the right approach.
We could keep going on AI all day. I want to touch on one more topic with it before we go somewhere else, which is I think both of us are very passionate about education. And I know you've thought a lot about this with kids as well. How do you think AI will change the way that students learn and just our education systems in general?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer it, but I'll give you my, I guess I'm a parent of 3 children, so does that qualify me to have an opinion? I'm really excited for it. My 3 kids have very different interests. My oldest is a computer geek like me. My middle child, endless curiosity about nature and always has a question. What's that tree? What's that leaf? What's that thing? You know, and after like the third question, I'm like, I have no idea. Okay, please stop asking why. Now I don't say that. I pull out my phone and I say, ask that question to ChatGPT. And it creates conversations where I'm learning things. And it's just absolutely amazing. And my youngest is really into art. And we just recently took a family trip and went to a few museums. And I asked questions about all the artists we were going to see that I didn't know the answers to. And then when we were walking through, I was telling her about it. First of all, I looked super smart in front of my daughter, which was awesome. But also it just made the experience of like learning. All of a sudden I had an art history lesson going into this museum. So there's a couple things on my mind just from those experiences, just how different my children are and the benefits they're getting from it today. I hope it opens the door to personalized education. It's always been the dream. We all learn differently. Some of us are visual learners. Some of us learn better through listening. I'm more of a reader. All of us learn at our own pace. Similarly, I mean, if you just look at the controversies in the US math curriculum over the past 10 or 20 years, there's lots of different ways to achieve the same outcome in terms of understanding a concept. And different approaches might resonate differently with different students. So I really hope we can lean into this, and teachers can end up using it as a tool when you have a student who's not getting your lesson plan. Find some alternatives so that student can perhaps understanding something they wouldn't have otherwise understand. And then for kids who just have a really deep passion, who maybe are at a school in a rural area that doesn't have that AP class or doesn't have the extra courses, how compelling is it to have a tool you can ask questions to? Hopefully it actually is not making things up. That's a whole separate story.
It's getting better.
It's getting better, and I think it will get better. And I just think that's incredibly exciting. So like, I was always inspired by like the story of like the mathematician Ramanujan who wrote letters to a professor in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
And I just hope there's a lot of kids in places that don't have access to tools that will end up being the next Einstein because these tools enable them to learn as much as they want at their own pace. I think that's really exciting. So
changing course a bit, in your career, you've worked on sort of all the things. You've worked on enterprise, you've worked on consumer. You can tell by my sport coat, I've embraced the enterprise. One thing that I'm always shocked by is I'll try to say this politely. It's always a great way to start a question. Brace yourself. I would posit, maybe you agree or disagree, that the average consumer UX is better designed than the average enterprise UX. Do you agree? You're saying that enterprise UIs stink. I'm not going to go that far, but I'm curious if you'd agree with that statement, first of all. I don't. Oh, OK. But I get where you're coming from. Do you want me to respond to your non-question? Let's hear it. It wasn't even really a question, was it? So I think the mistake that a lot of product designers get when it comes to enterprise software is a misconception about who the customer is, who the user is, and who the stakeholders are. And I use that stakeholder term really intentionally. Just take as an example filing expenses. As an employee of a company, you might think of the user experience of filing expenses, the act of taking a receipt, submitting it, and then having that money show up in your paycheck in the 1 month. It turns out that like if you're actually selling expense management software, there's a lot of different stakeholders. There's someone in the finance department. There's probably someone in procurement. There's probably a number of people in IT whose job it is to integrate that expense reporting system into their ERP system and to make the whole thing work. And I think, as users of enterprise software, we're just one stakeholder, one persona in that really multi-stakeholder system. And what ends up happening is, I think when you have enterprise software where the person making the purchasing decision is really far away from the person using the software, the user experience generally sucks. Exactly what you said. But it's in part because all the incentives of that enterprise software company is over to the person who's actually writing the check, which makes a ton of sense. And I think we've had, there's been a theme of consumerization of the enterprise written about by consultants for a really long time.
I think probably the thing that drove that forward with greater velocity than anything else was the emergence of product-led growth, because essentially product-led growth companies try to merge the persona of the purchaser and the user, and saying, hey, if we can enable the person signing up for the product to pull out their credit card and buy it, you really align the incentives around product design and sort of the act of purchasing it, which is the lifeblood of software as a service software. That will never happen for all software. Like, it turns out that, like, you know, not everyone using the ERP system is the person deciding to purchase it. It just is not the way that it works. You know, similarly, you know, there's your chief information security officer is probably buying software to protect your laptop from for patching or you know, to prevent intruders from coming in. And the end user and the purchaser are different. So the thing I'd tell you is I think that the way to produce better enterprise software is, first of all, I think it's, you know, products like Figma that have amazing user experiences and also great enterprise functionality should market their user experiences. People care about it. It's just not the only thing people care about. And I think product designers, even in the software that they use, I think we can do a better job of understanding all the different stakeholders. And I think if we can align all of the stakeholders' interests, you'll get better user experiences on the other side. It's just really complex. I think it really requires spending time with customers, spending time with sales teams, understanding not just like what the product does, but it's how it's sold and the value that it provides. My favorite framework is Clayton Christensen's Jobs to be Done. And I think really recognizing that like the job you hire a system to do is different than the screens that it manifests. And I think that sometimes we conflate those things, and that's why enterprise user interfaces are not, what'd you say? What was? Not always as good as, yeah.
Not always the same quality bar as
exactly
consumer,
right.
maybe?
Yeah.
I mean, going to Salesforce and eventually becoming co-CEO, you had this huge platform to impact the product portfolio of Salesforce. And as someone with a really high taste bar, I'm sure some of the things you saw were products that passed that taste bar and some of them weren't. How did you go about creating that change and sort of improving Salesforce's products at scale?
Salesforce is an amazing experience. First, my closest, I've mentioned a few mentors in this conversation, but Mark is the closest thing I've had to a father in enterprise software. Like, I learned more from him than anyone I've ever worked with. So it was just an amazing experience. And one of the things that Mark Benioff gets so well is community. It's the reason why we're in Moscone right now. I've been in this building a few times. And for those of you who live in San Francisco, once a year, there's this thing called Dreamforce, where 200,000 people descend on this city. And everyone who lives here half complains about it. The hotels love it, though. And it, you know, from afar, I always wondered, like, how does an enterprise software company get 200,000 people to show up? It's like a rock concert or religious revival or something. I didn't quite wrap my head around it. But it goes back to the different stakeholders. And one of the key stakeholders in Salesforce's business is the Trailblazer community. So the Trailblazer community are the Salesforce administrators and the Salesforce developers whose job it is to set up Salesforce at their company. And one of the things that we tried to do at Salesforce was really orient the company around them. You know, saying that like, we're essentially, this is sort of my words, not Mark's, but we are making this platform and these tools to make these people successful, because they're the people who are actually on the front lines enabling Salesforce for the businesses that they work for. And so when a product was, from my perception, not good, I would just spend time with the Salesforce administrators and Salesforce developers who worked on it day in and day out, because they always had better opinions than I had, because they were there, they were on the front lines. So I learned a couple things from that. You know, one is the power of tools. You know, when you think of something like Salesforce, it's not just the people looking at the screens, it's also the people setting it up, the administrators, the developers, the Trailblazers, but also the importance of community. I think it's something that Figma has always gotten right. You know, I think your community keeps you honest. Like, if your product stinks, like, and you have a healthy community, you hear about it. And I think products that don't have that aspect of community, I define community as like people, whether or not you had config, people would be getting together to talk about Figma anyway. That's a community, right? Because it's a tool people use to like build their careers and build their jobs. And I think having a strong community is one of the most amazing, impactful, and high leverage ways you can actually make good products.
So connect with your community, listen to them deeply. And if you don't,
I don't think there is a step 3. Like if you have a community, you listen to them. I think.
What if you don't have a community yet?
So that's hard.
Especially if you're not in a position to build a community. Let's say you're a manager at a company, you're trying to make the best product you can. What advice would you have for people in the room that might be in that position?
I think, are you talking for people who are building technology products?
Yeah, people
broadly?
building software products, trying to make the best product they can with their team. What would you tell them?
So I think when you think about building products, the thing I always think about is making your users and your stakeholders successful and really understand like what's driving them. I always thought about it in the context of Salesforce. Like I always wanted it that like your choice to use the product was the best decision you made that year. For the individuals who brought it in, they got promoted. Like for the service that they deploy, whatever business metrics had, they achieved. And I think if you focus on amplifying the voices around your product that are the champions of your voice, a community kind of emerges from that. And sort of how you operationalize is just how do you think about giving not just the voice to people at your company, but giving voice to the people around your company that are, influencing your customers, influencing your product. And I think effectively a community is sort of sharing the stage and manifests in conferences like this by all the speakers who don't work at Figma, right? And you're building the stage, they're getting on it. And I think more technology companies could benefit from really intentionally thinking about their community. And I think it is really an intentional process though.
Yep. I think in addition to community as a platform, the other thing that's really remarkable about everything you've touched is that you don't just build products, you build platforms. And I think it's pretty remarkable because most people barely ever get the opportunity to really build and design a platform. And we talked about Google Maps already, which I would consider to be an amazing platform. One thing that people haven't heard as much about here is the Facebook phone.
You really go for the deep cuts.
Do you want to talk about that?
You're just going to just lob that ball up there? That's all it is? That's enough? Gosh. If you're going to bring up all
I think it's a really interesting
if you're going to bring up all the failures, you should ask better questions. That's all I think. I'll describe sort of the mobile adoption at Facebook. I think it was a real demonstration of patience and both bad and good strategy at different points. When I arrived at Facebook, I'll get all the numbers wrong, but it was hundreds of millions of people using it. It was a widely used platform, largely young people. It had gone from being a college social network beyond that, but it was still at the point where your parents didn't use it yet. But it was growing really rapidly. It was quickly becoming a mainstream product, and it was wonderful. The growth was wonderful.
Around what year was this?
2000, I'll say, I was trying to think of, so iPhone was released in 2007, right? And Android was like 08 or 09. So around then, because this, neither Android nor the iPhone got adoption very quickly. It was actually like many of us had it, but not many people elsewhere.
Like 2009, 2010.
So call it 2009, 2010. Facebook was growing. We were planning to IPO, but smartphone adoption was growing really quickly. At the time, there's a lot of different phone platforms, though. So there was the Palm platform, there was the BlackBerry platform, and there was Android, which was growing rapidly, and the iPhone, which was growing rapidly. We made one technical decision early on that turned out to be good for the time, but a really bad decision, which was we basically standardized everything on HTML. And rather than build native products for every single one of these devices, there were so many of them, we sort of decided to optimize for product completeness, so you could do everything on your phone rather than product quality. Because at the time, I think it's sort of hard to imagine, but the phone was a bit more of an accessory to the experience than the experience. The interesting thing about exponential curves, though, is like it changed so rapidly and so quickly. I don't think our product kept up with the demands of our end users. And there was a point, and again, I'm through the lens of history, give me grace for getting the numbers wrong, but I'm pretty sure we had like a 2-star rating in the App Store. It was just slow. And if you just think about how slow mobile internet connections are now, like divide that by 10. It was abysmally slow. So in the developing world, people would just spend like their afternoon waiting for the app to load, you know? And it really required, I think, a really big pivot at the company. So first, we just started dog fooding all of our products on mobile. We started messaging through Facebook Messenger. We started using the mobile product exclusively and never using the desktop. We completely rewrote all of our Android and iOS apps to be native, and rewriting the product is a huge error-prone process, and I'm really proud of how that turned out. And the so-called Facebook phone, we ended up saying, like, what is the boldest thing we could do in this place? And essentially at the time, Android was a fairly fragmented ecosystem, and really thought, could you build sort of a flavor of Android where your social graph and these social features were at the center of it. And it ended up, I left before it launched. It eventually became a product called Facebook Home. It didn't go very well, but it's interesting because the thing I would say about that is so many of the capabilities of Facebook Home became native capabilities of the Facebook app on mobile. And a little bit like if you go back to that story about the Windows app that we were using to build Google Maps as sort of the high watermark. I always wonder, had we not been targeting sort of like, kind of like an operating system level of polish and completeness and innovation, would we have even come across some of those features as an app? So, I wasn't there when it launched, but even from my personal perspective, I have zero regrets. I thought it was like a really good exercise and produced a lot of interesting product designs that had long life, right, even after Facebook Home was retired.
I think that's fascinating, especially as we enter this new paradigm shift of AI, and that sort of those core principles of gather your community and listen to them, make sure that you understand what the high watermark is and how you can be native to this new paradigm rather than trying to adapt to the new paradigm. As you think about, because my personal belief is that most of us building software products are eventually going to wake up one day and go, oh, my strategy is to build a platform. It seems like the sort of natural arc of software.
Yeah.
So I'm curious.
Somewhere in there, your product sends email too. It's like send email, become a platform.
Become a chat message,
Yeah.
But I think it would be valuable for people who might be on the trajectory here to hear, are there any other tips you have of navigating that journey from product to platform?
Becoming a platform is really hard. And candidly, a lot of companies use that word, but aren't actually platforms. I think the most important thing in designing a platform is understanding the incentives of all the stakeholders on the platform. Typically developers, when targeting a platform, are seeking out distribution. I think a lot of developer teams spend a lot of time thinking about the API design and things like that, and it matters. But what really matters is distribution. And the reason why people develop plugins on Figma is because there's designers who use Figma. As good as the platform is, if you didn't have an audience, no one would be developing plugins besides me. I would still do it for you. I think there's been a lot of platforms that succeed for a short period of time, but then kind of fizzle out. And I think it's in part because if you don't develop like a continuous alignment of the incentives of your end users and your developers and the company that's building the platform, you end up having to sacrifice one of them. And typically over time, the developers get screwed because at the end of the day, if you end up for whatever reason not aligning the incentives of your third-party developers, and I think a lot of us as developers have developed on third-party platforms that have battle scars to show for it. And I think it's really important when you're designing a company to talk, and you want to be a platform, to talk about it, to have your developers have a seat at the table, your independent software vendors, because I do think incentives don't always align, and if it's an afterthought, rarely will you get that flywheel effect of something as powerful as the Apple's App Store or Salesforce's App Exchange or the platforms that have really, really reached scale.
We're about to end, but I have one last question.
Yeah.
You've got an amazing group of designers and design leaders in the room. Any hot takes on design or product building that you want to share in hopes that it'll influence the world of software?
Actually, what was a hot take is now the norm, but I'm a really big believer in inclusive design, that word means a lot of things. What I mean by that is including a lot of stakeholders in the design process, not having sort of ivory tower designs. And what I love about Figma is creating prototypes, interactivity, and like the ability to sort of include stakeholders like product managers, executives in the design process. And I think too often, as creators, we spend too much time in that private phase and not enough in the seeing how customers use it, seeing how other stakeholders react to it. So I don't think it's a hot take anymore, but I think tightening that cycle is probably the most powerful thing you can do to actually produce a good design at the end of the day.
Well, we're all about that, and we'll continue to try to do that. Thank you, Bret, so much for being here. Everyone, please thank Bret.
Thank you.
It's always an honor to talk with you and get a little bit of your brain. Bye, everybody. Thank you.